For the next several chapters, we're going to change our pace to having a broad overview of what happened during the civil rights movement, and then you will dive deeper into the primary sources and information that come from these major events of the civil rights movement. So, in this chapter, we're going to specifically look at the 1950s and more specifically the impact of the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case. So, your lesson objectives, you should be able to describe the backgrounds of key black men and women in the classic phase of the modern civil rights movement. You should be able to enumerate the events that inspired the NAACP to take up the case that resulted from the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision, and discuss why some may consider Brown to be one of the, if not the most important cases in the 20th century. You should also be able to identify the key components of white Southerners' strategy of massive resistance and explain their impact on the modern civil rights movement. So just to give a picture of the 1950s for you, this is going to be an era of unparalleled prosperity, a lot of consumer consumption. Most people are going to live in the suburbs, and at least 52% of Americans will own homes at this time. It's also characterized by stable nuclear families with stay-at-home moms. For African Americans, it will be less of a blissful situation. American society is still going to be rigidly segregated. Jim Crow laws will still be the supreme law of the land in the South. And the threat of white violence in the Deep South will keep African Americans from voting. Housing integration will not be something that will happen during this time. And most African Americans will not benefit from the prosperity and economic boom of the 1950s. And this is evident in the higher unemployment rates than any other segment of the U.S. population. So looking at the road to the Brown Supreme Court case. During this time, so prior to the court case, there's going to be a lot of legal programs in the 1920s and 30s that were set up by the NAACP that will help pave this road for the Brown court case. In 1940, NAACP will set up a legal defense and educational fund, and this group will fight segregation and discrimination in housing, education, employment, and politics. So two noted cases during this time will be Smith versus Albright, which will declare white primaries unconstitutional. We talked about this in the first lesson of this semester, where in Texas, for example, when the two Democratic candidates would go against each other in their primary, it was pretty certain that whoever won that primary would then win the election. And the state had outlawed African Americans participating in these primaries. And this was overturned in 1944. In 1948, we will also see advancement in outlawing restrictive residential covenants. So making it illegal to refuse to sell, rent, or lease property to African Americans. Even with this, there will still be ways that people can resist to this law, but this was a step. We will also see the rise of Constance Baker Motley, who was a NAACP legal defense lawyer, and she will symbolize the struggle of Black professionals at this time. So Constance Baker Motley, she was born in 1921, grew up in Connecticut. She did attend an integrated school and experienced some racism, such as being refused to go to a local beach or a skating rink. She is going to develop a very strong racial consciousness during this time. She's inspired to go to law school after hearing a speech from an NAACP lawyer. The problem was she couldn't afford to pay the education for law school. As a result, there will be a local white philanthropist who will offer to finance her education after hearing her speak at a meeting of Black and white community residents. She ends up becoming only the second Black woman to attend Columbia Law School. In 1946, she gets married and goes on to work with the NAACP Legal Defense. In the late 1940s, this group will attack inequality in graduate education on basis for assault on segregation. We talked about Sipwell versus Board of Regents, and we talked about Sweat versus Painter in a previous lesson, where both of these paved the way for insisting that you have a a program for graduate education or for law school that was equal to what was offered to white students at this time. We will also see the Supreme Court declare it illegal of the University of Oklahoma's segregation of a student in the Graduate School of Education. So the first taste of victory towards desegregation for education will be at the collegiate and graduate school level. So during this time, lawyers did try to pursue cases to fight segregation in education. Often lawyers who went to the South to pursue these cases were often assaulted. Judges often didn't address black female attorneys by their title, but by their first name only. For example, Motley was often just called Connie. They also would have to stay in flop houses for trials, or they would African-American families would open their homes to attorneys because local hotels and lodging establishments would not allow black people to stay at their establishments. During this time, black parents and their lawyers will file suit to get courts to declare separate but equal invalid in public education. There is a court case in 1950, Briggs versus Elliott. This will be the first legal challenge to elementary school education. And in this case, it happens in South Carolina, where there are 6,531 black students and only 2,375 white students in the county schools. The county had 30 buses for the white students to get them to school, but there were no buses available for the black students. Some of these students had to walk 18 miles round trip each day. Once they arrived, they entered buildings heated by wood stoves and lit by kerosene lamps, and for a drink of water or to go to the restroom, they had to go outdoors. And so this case became the first legal challenge to elementary school education to originate in the South. There will be some other court cases that will all be combined into one major court case that leads to the Brown Supreme Court case. So the legal defense group took on the cases, pulled them together with black lawyers and academics, and this leads to Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. Thurgood Marshall, who we've seen as a major player in the NAACP legal defense group, he's going to argue the case that separate but equal is erroneous. And during this time from 1953 to 1954, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren, will persuade the court to support Marshall. He knew that it had to be, to send a message, it had to be a unanimous decision. And the court rules unanimously in favor of the NAACP lawyers and clients. And they said classification based solely on race violated the 14th Amendment. The Brown case is going to lead to dismantling of Jim Crow laws. And a year later, the Supreme Court realized they needed to issue a follow-up ruling that they called Brown 2. And this was to address the process of desegregation and making sure that it happened at, quote, deliberate speed. And it's going to demand that states in these suits begin prompt compliance of desegregation. Now, there will be white resistance to this court case. So some examples of this, Reverend Jerry Falwell, who is in Virginia. He is going to state that black people are destined to be servants and inferior. He's also going to claim that Moscow inspired the Supreme Court decision. The White Citizens Council, which is a group dedicated to preserving the Southern way of life, they will end up firing and evicting black people and refusing them credit as a way of lashing out against this. A Mississippi congressman, James O. Eastland, he's going to call the Brown decision a monstrous crime. We will see the Virginia legislature will close public schools to even thwart integration. There will be a group of Southern senators who will write and issue what they call the Southern Manifesto, who vowed to fight to preserve segregation and the Southern way of life. And this group will be led by Sam Ervin Jr. of North Carolina and Strom Thurmond of South Carolina. And the only two Southern senators who did not sign the Southern Manifesto will be Al Gore Sr. of Tennessee and Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas. So the effects of these examples of resistance that happen to the Brown versus Board of Education case is a very slow rollout of integration. We will see Southern states will file suit to try to get rid of the NAACP. They saw it as a threat to their way of life. Some areas will make membership in the NAACP illegal. There are going to be some states that will allege that the NAACP was linked to a communist conspiracy. Membership will plummet, especially in the South, and several branches will also be lost. So, under these pressures, desegregation is going to ground to a halt. By 1958, only 13 school systems are desegregated, and 2 years later, it had only risen up to 17. In the wake of the Brown decision, white Southerners had violent reactions to black victories and assertiveness, and this is very evident in what happened in the summer of 1955 and the lynching of 14-year-old Emmett Till. Till was visiting relatives in a small town in Mississippi. He was unaware how far white people would go to avenge any real apparent breach of white supremacy's racial etiquette. And what was actually said by Till to a white woman owner of a store may never be known, but the general racial hostility in this time is going to embolden the woman's husband and brother-in-law to kidnap and murder Emmett Till. His body was found in a river tied to a heavy cotton gin fan. Till had a bullet in his head and had been tortured before his murder. Despite overwhelming evidence and testimony of Till's uncle and others, an all-white jury will acquit the two men who had lynched Till. The two murderers even sold their confessions to a magazine and gloated over their escape from justice. The Till lynching will help shape the consciousness of a generation of young African American activists. Partly this was due to Till's mother, Mamie Bradley. Unwilling to let America turn away from this crime, she had her son's mangled body displayed in an open casket in Chicago. Thousands of mourners paid their respects, and many committed themselves to fighting the system that made the crime possible. Bradley also traveled around the nation, speaking to groups on whom her grief had a profound impact. We will also see this have a later role in the greater movement for civil rights. So in conclusion, 1950s was still a tough time for African Americans, and our biggest victory will be the two Brown decisions that ended the legal foundation for segregation and discrimination. Now, what we will start to see after this is we will continue to see white Southerners' resistance to these changes, and we will see all the way up into the 21st century court cases and fights against desegregation or resegregation in public schools.